Thank you very much, Amikai and IDC, for having me again. This is my second time around here at this conference. Last time was 5 years ago, and it's amazing to see how the place has changed physically and the dynamism on campus and how this is growing, and fantastic to see how a university landscape can thrive. I like it a lot. It's for me also, since I'm not a counter-terrorism person, but more a geopolitics guy from a European perspective, it's a bit of a blind date, right? Coming to the conference, which is a counter-terrorism summit. And that's why I'm actually stepping maybe 1 or 2 steps back even from what we just heard from the official NATO side to talk about European security and NATO's role in it. For a long time, Europe, was in a way, for many people outside of Europe, a boring place. It wasn't very high on the list of, strategic drama. But that's going to end quite soon, and it is in the process of ending very rapidly, I think, and it will be high on the list on strategists around the world. It will be getting exciting in a pretty negative way, I think, fairly soon. And NATO, of course, will have to play a key role in this. As a think tanker, I have the privilege of being sufficiently imprecise about everything that I say. So if you want more precision, more detail, that's probably for Q&A. But I'll give you a rough idea, a big picture kind of analysis of how I think things are moving. When I said earlier that that the European political landscape and strategy was kind of a boring thing for a long, long time, that was because for the most part of the last 70 years, the European strategic market was closed. It was settled because it was owned by the US. And that has changed over the last 25 years, slowly but surely. We have seen over the last 25, almost 30 years, a relatively systematic winding down of the American political and military footprint in Europe. We've seen a little bit of an uptick after 2014, but not anywhere near a volume that would make up for the losses that we've seen over the generation before that. And what that means is that the trust infusion that America brought to the internal dynamics of Europe, but also the protection that it brought to the external dimension of Europe, has been diminished. The American security guarantee is in doubt these days, not just because of Donald Trump and his personal travails, but also because of the systematic reduction of the footprint. And I think this cannot be neglected here. And this goes to the core business of NATO, because NATO really is the organization that administers the US security guarantee to Europe. That's its core function. It basically administers America's real estate in Europe. To put it bluntly, this is something that really drives up the wall our European audiences all the time, because I'm thinking along the lines of real estate or spheres of influence, if you will, which is the geopolitician's view on things. The U.S. has not just been cashing in the peace dividend in Europe, it's also leaving Europe because it needs to go elsewhere. There is a different new strategic kind of paradigm in the world. Europe is no longer the key kind of soup kitchen for stability in the world. That is now Asia. It used to be Europe. It's no longer Europe. So as a matter of fact, the key kind of power player in the universe in the world, America needs to go elsewhere as well. So it needs to actually take some of its assets out of Europe. But it's also distracted because it's busy with itself. We have a very inward-looking United States at the moment, a very domestic debate in the US. And with the exception of perhaps China, the rest of the planet is getting very little attention, at least for the most part in the US debate. You will always find your specialized communities, but overall the attention span for global stability services to provide is a lot shorter than it used to be. And that opens up the European strategic market. It's also open for a number of other reasons. First of all, there's Russia, which is quite interested in opening up the market again. It has always been so, but it has, now very clearly defined itself against the Western model, and it is now more openly than before trying to uncouple the Europeans from the Americans and splitting the Europeans up amongst each other. So it's investing quite a bit into opening up that strategic market and making it less stable, because that, as it calculates in Moscow, is serving the Russian interest. That's, of course, not how we see it, but that's clearly how Mr. Putin and his power system sees it. We also have China that is interested in opening up the European strategic market. China has a very, very long-term view on Eurasian affairs, and Europe is part of Eurasia. And getting Europe connected to the core Chinese market through Belt and Road is one of the key principal affairs, and it is trying to very systematically invest and buy itself into the European market, uncouple it from Europe, having a say in it, becoming over time a veto player in its politics. So that's happening at the same time as well. And then we have the Europeans who are alerted, of course, who are not stupid. They see that this is happening, but they're not quite there yet when it comes to finding a cohesive answer to this. You see a frantic debate. It's quite disorderly. A frantic debate on defense spending, the European defense contribution, 2%, of course, about strategic autonomy, which is a buzzword, about Germany's contribution, because Germany is probably the biggest underperforming player in my own country in Europe, and about a number of other buzzwords that you will find in the papers all the time, but they're all a symptom of the same kind of debate. The Europeans sensing that their market is opening up, and they're trying to find an answer to close it again, but they're not quite there yet. Plus, they also sense their own weakness, and they sense that if they want to actually close the market again, they will have to do something that will be quite unprecedented at a scale that they're not really prepared to do, and I will come back to this a bit later. One of the things that I was surprised about, both by the presentations by Benedetta and Amica, was that nuclear wasn't mentioned at all. But the real big strategic shift that we see at the moment in Europe is that the nuclear equilibrium in Europe is out of tilt again. Something that was probably NATO's finest moment, dual track, in the late 70s and early 80s, is out of the window, and the nuclear deterrence question, Europe is open again. And the INF, the end of the INF treaty, illustrates the openness of the European strategic market beautifully. Because it tells you, first of all, both Russia and the US were interested in getting out of INF because of China. China had used the moment where those two countries were bound by the INF treaty to invest massively into intermediate range missile technology. Both Russia and the United States needed to do something about it, so they needed to get out of INF. So for a reason that was not European, a treaty that was all about Europe had to be cancelled, thereby getting the entire equilibrium in Europe out of place, which tells you that Europe is no longer the first priority in global strategy. There was a decision that was made that affected the Europeans massively, getting out of INF by both parties, that the Russians started to violate 10 years ago. It was about Europe, but the Europeans weren't even consulted. That tells you how low on the priority list they actually are when it comes to these global stability issues. It also tells you something about the imbalance in importance that Russia and the United States assign to Europe. For the US, still Europe is kind of a done deal. I'm overdoing a little bit, but there's a lot less concern about the overall stability in Europe. Whereas for Russia, Europe is the primary concern. Their big concern about the INF was China, but if that also opens up Europe for them, because they can actually get the upper hand in nuclear presence in Europe, that's great for them. So it tells you something about this openness that I'm always coming back to. And then the Europeans themselves do not have the assets to balance it out. If America is not willing, unlike in the 70s and 80s, to balance out the intermediate missile threat, then the Europeans do not have the means to do this themselves, which means that they're in a nuclear quagmire. There's the risk of getting nuclear blackmailable. There's a risk of them having to call Moscow first in the future and not Washington, which is a huge risk. So you have, as the result of INF, something becoming very slowly a reality, and that is the old NATO nightmare, which is strategic uncoupling between the United States and Europe. That this transatlantic space is no longer one space, that the security of the United States is no longer the same thing as the security of Europe. That was always the assumption in NATO. But now with this intermediate missile threat and the kind of wider landscape that I pictured earlier, that is no longer the case. And you can argue that this that the old assumption that NATO rested on, the kind of one space that can never be divided, is already out of the window. Perhaps something for the discussion later on. It certainly opens up the strategic market. For me, the key question in all of this, and also for the future of NATO, is does the US want to keep its real estate in Europe? Does the US want to maintain Pax Americana that was invoked earlier, maintain it in Europe, not just elsewhere, but also in Europe, and can it? Is it capable of doing so when it has other much bigger fish to fry elsewhere? And this leads us to NATO as the principal organization that organizes the security guarantee. NATO's credibility as a security organization depends on many of the things that we've heard, but it depends on one thing ultimately, and that is whether there's a US commitment to Article 5. Is America willing to use it? That, for me, is just a variation of the question whether it wants to keep its real estate, really. In a way, you can say that NATO is a real estate agency. It does not depend on the 2% question, even though that's the way this is being discussed in Europe at the moment, because Donald Trump has successfully reframed the debate about NATO solidarity and alliance cohesion and turned it into a cost question, which it is not. If you think that NATO depends on 2%, you have been fooled. America has never defended Europe for cost reasons, as a money-making deal. It has defended Europe because it was in its strategic interest. And it will continue to do so or not. But it will not depend on 2%. This doesn't mean that 2% isn't important. I have very strongly argued in favor of 2% in my own market back in Germany, which doesn't make you very popular there. But it is not the decisive question of NATO. The decisive question in NATO will have to be answered in Washington, not in Europe. Does America still want to defend Europe? Yes or no? Is it in its strategic interest? And can it do so? So we have to really get this straight. The Europeans undoubtedly have to do more. And some of what they do will have an impact on the future of NATO, there's no doubt. But ultimately, the question is on Washington's side. The future of NATO will depend on 4 decisions that America will have to make, in my opinion. 4 decisions, very quickly. First of all, does the United States want to balance out the nuclear missile threat after the demise of the INF Treaty? Secondly, does it want the Europeans as allies in its kind of coming standoff with China, yes or no, and in what form? Does it want that's number 3 now, does it want European defense to be organized collectively or as a multitude of bilateral arrangements? The United States with Poland, the United States with Portugal, the United States with Estonia, or does it still want to maintain this kind of collective effort inside of NATO? And then the 4th question is, can it accept a Europe, a bit further down the line in the future, can it accept a Europe that will be a more independent player also militarily? Because we're getting mixed signals from Washington. On the one hand, do more, but then please, buy our kit. Don't get too independent on your own armaments industry. That's not really a viable strategic position on the American side. So how much more do you want the Europeans actually to do, and how much more independence can you swallow if such a thing were to emerge? So that's a big question. Those are the 4 that I think are decisive. A couple more points before I finish. What's the European say in all of this? For me, it's, again, I try to boil it down to simple questions because that's how I function. I think in the end, the Europeans will have to find out how they can more smartly handle their dependence because they will not be independent. That's my guess, at least not in the medium term and certainly, most likely not in the long term. They will have to find out how to reduce dependence on the United States, and that means spending, capabilities, and the willingness to deploy. But they will not be able to completely get out of its dependence on the US. And if we're talking about the Europeans, actually, and this is also important in this context, we are actually really maybe only talking about maybe 5 or 6 countries. We're not talking about 28 or 29 or 30. We're talking about the 5 or 6 that matter. That's, of course, the big 3, the UK, France, and Germany. And then we're talking about Spain and Italy, and then we're talking about Poland and perhaps the Netherlands and Sweden. But that's about it. Everybody else is basically too small to really matter. Not totally unimportant, and certainly part of the European security architecture, but they will not make a difference that will change the calculation of the opponent. So 5 or 6 countries are the ones that have to get their act together. And they will need to accept this dependence and that they will not become fully independent. And here I will make my last point, and I have many more beautiful points for later. But this one thing about independence and about strategic autonomy, and also really just about maybe doing a little more, not full independence, is a question of spending, and spending means domestic political fights. this is often forgotten. This is not just about some strategic argument, that makes sense, let's spend more. These are hard-fought domestic fights in every budget committee around Europe. What we have is a Europe whose security was subsidized for 70 years, didn't have to spend the full amount on its own defense, and was not supposed to do this. And that means that spending patterns have absolutely, kind of solidified in the way that we do politics. We are used to not spending a whole lot more on defense than we do now. If we were to spend a lot more, let's say, to get strategic autonomy, we're not talking 2, we're talking maybe 6% of GDP. Or maybe even more if you count in nuclear, I don't know. But roughly this, there are various calculations out there. If you want to imagine a Europe that spends 5 to 6%, what you will have to imagine is a Europe that has to break out of spending patterns that have been in place for 2.5 generations. You will have to prepare for domestic fights, over kindergarten versus fighter jets in every single country that has to do this. And these are usually very difficult fights to fight. So the European politicians that are reluctant, to spend more are not just doing this because they're pacifists or free riders, or don't get the story. It's also that they actually have to risk their political lives back home to get more of that money on the defense side of the chart. And those are the most difficult political fights to fight domestically. Now, of course, external pressure and fear will, simplify that a little bit. But in the long term, think about what this means. You all know this from your own countries, how this works in your countries when the budget debates are going on, where to allocate the money. Is it education? Is it social spending? Is it research and development? What is it? If we want a Europe that is more independent, we have to prepare for these kinds of fights. The strategic argument that we like to make, the threat stuff and the insecurity and the big global order questions, will not cut it. You have to go to your budget politicians who know nothing about this and make a case to them. And that'll be a very difficult fight. And I think, very last sentence, NATO and the money that it needs for all of this will depend largely on these budget fights in the future. I'll skip you the rest of my jokes and we'll talk about this later. Thank you very much.